Hi folks, welcome to this week's episode of the Physical Education Podcast. This week I'm going to be talking about the topic of personal responsibility. So that's what I'd been talking about this week in my newsletters. Had a couple of newsletters just discussing why I tend to harp on about personal responsibility and sort of clarifying certain objections that people have when they hear the words personal responsibility. So I'm going to be elaborating on that today in this episode. And so basically, I kind of think about this recently, like I'm not really talking that much about back pain and my business, and what I do is the back pain coach, and I'm sort of focused on back pain. And just to sort of clarify why I don't talk that much about back pain these days, is largely because, like I said, there's not much that's new on the topic. We haven't discovered a new special stretch that you've been missing out on that is the key to your recovery. We haven't discovered a new device that's going to solve your back pain. What I've come to the conclusion of is that most of these issues, and I talked about this last week, but I'm going to say it again, is that the issue is that it's the way you think. It's all about changing the way you think. The answers are there, the solutions are there. It's all there for you to apply. Like there's nothing, like if we were to work together and we solved your issue, you wouldn't be experiencing some unveiling of some secret method or some secret thing that you'd never heard of. You might be surprised by certain things, but for the most part, you know this stuff already, and there isn't anything new to be said on the topic, really. Maybe a few things. The key is to get you to absorb the information in the right way, so that it is absorbed in this sort of subconscious way, and you begin to live your life more in your favor. So with the new understanding that you have about health, about how things work, you now start to act in a way that's more favorable to your health and to your pain. And that's really what it's all about. It's the reason why there are a bazillion diets and exercise plans, but people are still obese and overweight and still trying new diets, and they'll give up and then they'll try another one. It's because it's a behavioral thing, it's an understanding thing. For the most part, there's obviously nuance to all of these things, but it's very much about you understanding how to live in your best interest, because health is always going to be a lifelong effort. It's not something you do once, it's not something you do over 6 weeks and then you're done. It's going to be a lifelong effort to not be in pain. And that's not to say that you're going to have to work hard for the rest of your life to not be in pain. It's just going to be that the changes you make now will need to be lasting changes. So that's reality. That's just it. That's just the way it is. It's unpleasant. It sounds complicated. It would be easier to just have a pill. It'd be easier for someone to just solve the problem for you, but that's not the way it is. That's reality, and we can either acknowledge reality and work with it, or we can be in denial and continue to take a pill or to have a chiropractor crack our back and then do nothing for ourselves. So once you acknowledge this reality, personal responsibility sort of goes hand in hand with it. And now the major objection that people have when you start bringing up personal responsibility is they'll say, well, you're just saying pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It's all your fault. You just have to solve your own problem. And I recognize that people do that. You'll hear that more so in politics. Like someone's poor, they've been poor their whole lives, they're not doing well, and some rich person who was born into a rich family and has always done well and has never really wanted or struggled for anything is saying, well, they just don't try hard enough. And I just want to be perfectly clear, because I'll explain this clearly and people still won't get it. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not blaming you for your pain. I'm not saying it's all your fault. I'm not saying any of that. I acknowledge that some people just have an easier time. Some people, just everything seems to work out for them because of where they're born, who they're born to, their parents, and all sorts of things. And there's luck involved in all these things, and that's fine. And we can get all into the nitty-gritty of that, and that's cool. By all means, do that. Understand that about yourself. But the bottom line is, all you can do is what you can do. It's tremendously hard to change people, and it's tremendously hard to change major systems. So I'm going to talk about, eventually I'm going to talk about how the medical system isn't geared towards, it's not geared in our favor when it comes to chronic health issues. And it's going to be tremendously hard to change that. So all I can think of right now is, let's start with personal responsibility. Let's start with doing the best that we can, because if you're waiting for the entire medical industry and pharmaceutical industry and the whole culture that comes from that, if you're waiting for that to change and for that to solve your problem, by all means do that, but you're going to be waiting a very long time. So let's sort of expand on why the medical system why the medical system just isn't really geared towards chronic issues. And again, I will reiterate that I'm talking about chronic health issues. I'm not talking about traumatic injuries. I'm not saying, if you get a gunshot wound or you fall off a building, just take personal responsibility and just think positive or anything like that. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying the medical system is bad in that case. There's a very clear distinction between trauma and emergency care and saving a life versus sustaining good health and creating good health. They're two very different things, but they're broadly called medicine, but they look very different. So I'm not talking about that. I'm not saying think positively if you get a gunshot wound or whatever. I'm saying in the case of chronic health issues, things that emerge over time that do not respond to simple solutions, that require essentially sort of overhaul of your life and your living and your habits and everything, and issues that are deeply ingrained, the medical system is not geared towards treating that. Part of that is just practical. So we've all been to the doctor, or we've all had an experience where you're waiting a long time to see a doctor, you're waiting a long time to see a specialist, and you're lucky if you get 10 minutes with them. So just from a practical point of view, without getting into anything else, unless you want to pay a lot of money, and you can afford to pay a lot of money to have someone listen to you for an hour, a top-ranking doctor to listen to you for an hour or longer over several weeks, unless you can do that, you'll be lucky if you get to talk to them for 10 minutes and get to really get into the details of what's going on. Because that's just how, and I don't think that's necessarily a flaw in the design. That's just maybe a reality of the demand versus the amount of people who need a doctor versus the amount of doctors there are. So if there's tons of people who need an appointment, then you need to manage how long you give each person, otherwise you'll never get through everyone. So that's just a practical consideration, that when you have a chronic health issue that's deeply ingrained, that you've had for years and you've been adapting with and you've been dealing with, and you've got all sorts of sort of peripheral things that are tied into it, if you go and talk to a doctor, even if it's the best doctor, the person who really understands this, and you get 10 minutes of their time, it's just going to be really, really hard to get to the bottom of it. When I deal with people, I have them fill out a form, and then we do a free 30-minute call, and that usually ends up being a free 1-hour call, because there's so much to cover, and that's all the free portion. And then we start working together, and we might work an hour at a time, and we're picking things apart, and we're looking at the bigger picture, and we're understanding all these little details and how they connect together. And I do that because Like all I'm interested in is what is the best solution. Like if 10-minute appointments were a better solution, then I would do that. But I can't see that they are a better solution, so I don't do that. I used to do longer than an hour actually, but then I found that was too much. I think it's too much for people to absorb all at once. So I'm just trying to find what's best. An hour is kind of convenient, but anyway, that's I'm going off on a tangent. Point is, it takes time to get to know you, get to know who you are. What kind of person are you? So if I'm working with you, are you more visual? Are you more auditory? Do I have to, like, do you just want to understand all the ins and outs of things? Or do you want to feel it? Or do you want to see it? Or how do you learn? How do you absorb this kind of information? What's your background? Like, if you're a healthy, active person, can I throw 10 exercises at you? But if you're a sedentary person who doesn't really have much awareness of their bodies, am I going to throw 10 exercises at you? And is that going to work or not? It's probably not going to work. So what is going to be right? And how much of all of this can I get? How much of this information can I get in a 10-minute consultation when I've had back-to-back consultations for a full day, and I'm overworked and I'm in debt and I'm tired and all this and whatever else. So just from a purely practical point of view, when you're dealing with a very complex issue, which all chronic health issues are reasonably complex, because you start with one problem, and because we're so adaptable, we'll manage. But managing means creating a knock-on effect. It means creating a compensation. Simple example is, well, I twist my ankle and I kind of get on with it. I shift my weight off, so I'm loading the opposite hip a bit more, and I'm bearing more weight through that leg, so maybe I'm using those muscles more, and I'm using the injured side a bit less, and that creates an adaptation, which is an inefficiency, and my body, it deals with that, because you just keep on going. Like, we're very adaptable, and it's great, but it does mean that as things ripple over time, you get more and more accumulated compensation and adaptation, and you get this ripple effect of issues. So the issue is no longer I hurt my ankle, it's now I've got an altered gait, or maybe I've got fear surrounding walking on my ankle, and maybe that's peppered in with my understanding of the body, and maybe I feel like the body is this very fragile thing. And all of these things influence and color and filter through and create our understanding of our issue. And so when I'm treating you, or when someone is treating you, or when you are seeking a solution, you need to look at the entirety of the problem. Who are you? What are your... So I can use myself as an example. So I dealt with it was Lyme's disease from a very early age, but that's sort of one thing, and I use that example of an injured ankle, and you shift your weight off, and that was my example. So I had this arthritic symptoms in my left ankle, and it has created ripple effects to this day. I've got postural adaptations to this day, over 20 years later, that are just a consequence of that. But within that, there are all the experiences that I had around that age of 9, and a bit before and a bit after, and I won't get into them, but there were significant life changes, forms of trauma, nothing physical or abusive trauma in that sense, but major changes to my life, and that's all kind of I've found by exploring my pain, exploring what's going on, that all of these things are linked to some extent. And I found that certain movements, for example, are very hard for me to do, and like they're very emotional for me to do. So if I were to force myself into a certain position, this is all very subtle, it's all very subtle movements, It's not like if I if I moved into this random position I would suddenly start crying or something like that. But it's all these, when you get into studying biomechanics and you see all these little intricacies, I've noticed that there are certain movements that I never do with my left hip and that I really struggle to access, and I understand them in this mechanical way. I can say, look, I'm lacking this internal rotation there and the shift of the pelvis there, and I understand that. I understand that that's something that's sort of lacking in the way I move, and when I try to do it, it doesn't feel right. I'm not able to do that movement properly. Now, if you look at that as purely a mechanical thing, you're thinking, well, we'll just encourage you into that position until you get comfortable with it. But what I've noticed is when I create enough space to observe and to be aware, and in the context of understanding the entirety of my health and my life story, I realize that I really, really do not want to go into that position. There is some sort of significant, trauma or anguish that comes up, and I kind of shut down, and I'm like, oh, I don't want to go there. That's very unpleasant. And so when you understand that, you can understand that if I wanted to fully deal with this issue, and I do, and I will eventually, a chiropractor who thinks, or, the average chiropractor who might think in a purely mechanical way is not going to be the right approach for that. Maybe I need to see a psychotherapist or some sort of physical therapist with a psychological background or whatever it is. The point is, my understanding of that will guide the solutions that I seek out. So if I go to, because I've talked about this before, but like when you have pain, you sort of immediately assume that, well, I'll go to a physio or I'll go to a doctor, and you think in mechanical terms. You think I'll go to the people who are essentially the mechanics of human bodies, but you don't think, oh, I've got this pain, maybe I should see a psychologist or a counselor or a psychotherapist or whatever it is, or maybe I should see a nutritionist. You don't think in those terms, and this relates back to the flaws with how medicine is done, is because everything's been compartmentalized. Nutrition is nutrition, and biomechanics are biomechanics, and they are not related, even though they occur in the same body. And the only reason there's a distinction between the two is because we dissected a body and drew a line here and said, that's that, and this is this, and they're separate because I say so, and that's the way it is, and entire industries have been built around that, and people have, they're experts in that thing, and so they're not, they've got no incentive to say, oh, actually, I might be an expert in this tiny portion of a larger whole, and it's sort of meaningless in isolation. There's no incentive to acknowledge that. And so if you think about, again, resistance, I talked about, like, I don't want to perform that movement. I don't want to move into that position, and that's rooted in some sort of traumatic experience, and I don't know what it is exactly. It's something to uncover, and I'll uncover it eventually. It's not too pressing, but I've got resistance there, and I don't want to acknowledge that, and that's just a human phenomenon. We have our worldview, we have the things that we believe, we have the things that we know, and we have our lives built around them, and if something threatens that, that's tremendously uncomfortable. It's really, really uncomfortable. So again, this is my point about, you don't need another stretch, or chances are you probably don't need another stretch to help you out with your back pain or whatever it is. You need to understand where are the shortcomings in your worldview and how you view things, and how can you change that? How can you expand the way you think, and so on. So hopefully that makes sense. So there's this there's the reality of the practicality of getting treatment from a doctor, which is just, unless you can pay a lot of money for a lot of their time, and that's, because they're in such high demand, they can charge very high amounts of money, and that's cool. If you can afford that, go ahead, but most people can't. So practically speaking, having zero sort of ownership of your body and personal responsibility is not going to work in your favor if you're going to go purely down a sort of modern medicine route. So if you have this problem, and I did this early on with my pain, I had the Lyme's disease, and that was treated, but then I had ripple effects over time. And you go to the hospital, you go to the doctor, and they're like, I'll go for an x-ray. And then you go there and you're waiting, and then you're lucky if you get 2 minutes of a physio who's had a look, and they're like, here's a page of stretches, do those. Okay. Nothing happens. There's no understanding of any greater context. Like I'm trying to explain this, but I'm like, does this need to be explained? Is this not abundantly clear to anyone who's been in this situation? Like, it's not at all fit for purpose, this system. If you're dealing with a chronic health issue, it just doesn't work. So you go to the hospital, and then they'll give you maybe a sheet of stretches. Do those stretches, come back in a month, and sure, God knows, like, what's going to happen in a month. Like, maybe the issue kind of calms down on its own, and that's usually what they're banking on. Like, it'll probably just go away on its own. Here's some stretches, whatever. I don't care. Your life isn't threatened, so I don't really need to do anything. And that's the reality. And the only way that I started getting or making progress with my health is repeatedly having these experiences and being forced to realize that I needed to take matters into my own hands, and I needed to just figure this out for myself. And it doesn't mean that you have to become a physical therapist and understand anatomy, but you need to at least have the owner's manual for your body, and that could just mean paying attention, having the awareness to know how your body reacts to certain things. What is your life story? How do these key moments in your past, how do they make you feel? What do they represent? How are they embodied? So because your thoughts and your experiences aren't these purely nebulous things. They inhabit within you, and they can inhabit within you in a very mundane way that's sort of inconsequential, but they can also inhabit you in this very visceral and clear way, where the real way out of a psychological issue is through movement, is through exploring the internal and the sensations, and not just the thoughts and the words. And the point is that it could be either of these things, it could be any of these things, and the way you figure that out is by figuring it out, is by confronting it and saying, okay, well, this is my body, these are my thoughts, these are my experiences, and they're mine, and no one else can truly understand them. People can help me with them, people can guide me and give me assurance and help, but they are mine to address, mine to own. And again, that's just the reality that at some point you're going to need to acknowledge. Now, like I said at the start, people will say, well, we're not all as fortunate as you, and this, that, and the other. And like, I don't want to pretend that I had this miserable life and it was all hard, but I also, I've heard a few people say, well, you're talking from a place of privilege, and I'm like, well, hold on a minute. You don't know what I've been through. You don't know what I've had to put up with. And that's the thing, you don't know what anyone is going through, and I acknowledge that. I don't know what you're going through, so I'm not going to say, look, it's all up to you. All I'm going to say is that, look, it can only be up to you, because the other support structures are not fit for purpose. That's the world we live in. If you're not going to take on as much as you can possibly take on, then I'm sorry, but you're going to have problems, because it's not a system that's fit for purpose when it comes to chronic health issues. So that's just that sort of painful reality, and people can get very upset, and I understand that. Like, I didn't come to this conclusion like that easily. It wasn't like, oh, okay, I guess I gotta be responsible. There's resistance, there's blame, there's like, oh, well, what about this and what about that? And you can acknowledge all the people who have wronged you and all the people who are responsible for the poor care that you've gotten. Because, my issues started when I was about 8 or 9, and I'm not going to say to 8 or 9-year-old, look, you got to take personal responsibility. There are people I can blame for the standard of care I received at the time and how that poor standard of care rippled over time. I can point fingers. I know how to do that. I have that clearly in my mind. I've identified that. But that doesn't do anything. So you can do all that. You can acknowledge all the wrong that's been done to you, but just do that in order to move on. For the sake of clarity, not to wallow in it, not to shift the blame. The blame can go towards them, but the action needs to come from you, and because, otherwise nothing changes. So I understand if you're struggling with this, or if you feel like the issue is entirely someone else's, it's someone else's fault, but it's highly unlikely that you can get them to undo what has happened. So if you're truly committed to getting better, you can acknowledge what they've done, how you were led astray or let down, and move on from there and just say, okay, that's what happened, fair enough, what can I do now? Because you can only ever control yourself. And that's this other thing that took me a long time to understand, was that it's tremendously hard to help people. People seek out help, but I think there's a distinction between their conscious seeking out for help and whether they're actually unconsciously truly ready to receive help. Because people will come in and say, look, I'm in pain and I've got this and, I just want to get better. But when you give them a solution that doesn't fit within their worldview, that isn't what they expected, they often won't do it. And there are reasons for that. Maybe you just didn't explain it properly. Maybe they don't understand properly, and that can happen. But part of it can be that they're not truly ready for a solution. They only want a solution as far as it doesn't threaten their worldview. So they have a view of the world, they have a comfort zone, they have the way they view things and what makes them comfortable and feel safe. And if your solution doesn't fit within that framework, it's quite possible that there will be a significant amount of resistance to what you're saying. And that's something that you kind of need to contend with. If you are a person receiving care, and ask yourself, well, I've been given this advice, why haven't I acted on it? Why have I dismissed it? And reflect on that. Say, what is it that doesn't seem right about this? And you can talk to the therapist, or you can ask me, like, why do you think, and this happened to me recently, and I was dealing with someone, and it was back pain, and I was very confident that it was a nutritional issue. And because of the extent of it, I wanted to refer them out. And obviously when people come to you, they've kind of bought into you to some degree. They've looked at your website and they're kind of like expecting a treatment from you. But based on the information I had and a long conversation, I felt, look, you need to go to this other person. I'll refer you out to this person because they're more equipped to deal with what you're dealing with. And there's this kind of deflating moment of like, well, I came, and I noticed this when I worked in a health food shop. People come in and they want a supplement. You're like, actually do this instead. And they didn't want a solution. They just wanted to buy something. There's an element of that. So there's this deflating kind of thing of, what? Well, no, I came to you, fix me. And obviously those weren't their words, but there's this kind of resistance. And in this case with this person I was dealing with, I really pushed the nutritional angle, and they were like, oh, I don't really get it, and why this? I feel like I never notice any change in my symptoms based on my nutrition, and I had to explain, and so some of that resistance is legitimate. It's like, well, I'm open to the idea that maybe nutrition is relevant to my back pain, but I don't see my symptoms change in relation to the foods that I eat. And so I had to explain that the nutrition creates the foundation for the regeneration of the body, and ultimately what they were dealing with was this degenerative issue that, you know, you can't outstretch and you can't outmobilize. You need to change the building blocks that are going. You need to change the internal chemical, biological environment that is sustaining this. So part of that was just an educational issue. I needed to explain why nutrition was so important to them. But there was this resistance of, you know, they're expecting, and I still gave them this, you know, other basic mobility things, but, you know, when we seek out treatment, when we are in pain, we have this idea of what the solution is. And when we're given the solution and it doesn't really fit within that, it's kind of jarring, it's kind of deflating. And you're like, well, why? You know, I wanted this. And so you kind of have to ask yourself, am I looking for a solution? Am I looking for a real solution? Or am I just looking for something that I can feel like I'm doing something that doesn't really threaten my worldview? And this was this was potentially happening in this case because this person, like, as part of what they said about their diet, they were vegetarian. So what I was saying potentially threatened that worldview, among other things. So it's something that you need to contend with, and it's the point that I covered last week, is that we don't really get to choose what the solution is. And that's, again, part of the problem, is that healthcare is sort of this consumer industry. You know, we get to pick and choose this, that, and the other, but that's one thing. But actual health doesn't conform to that. You don't get to pick and choose what is going to be appropriate. I mean, practically speaking, you can, in that you can choose to get this treatment versus that treatment. But in the objective world of, this is the problem that I have, and I need this problem resolved completely, in that context, you don't get to choose what the solution is going to be. There is a true solution, and that true solution may suit you or may not suit you based on your beliefs, but that is a true solution. What tends to happen is we go for partial solutions. We go for temporary remedies that don't threaten that worldview, that don't make us have to reassess and reevaluate and change our entire being. And that's, I think, part of why there are so many solutions available to us, so many different types of therapies and therapists and modalities and all this, because we're tremendously adaptable, and we're very willing to take a partial solution, because pain is not a constant. Generally, even at its worst, it's not always a constant. So if we can even just keep that down a bit and just kind of manage it, then we're going to be okay with that, and we can do this partial solution because it doesn't impair our ability to maybe do these other things that we know we shouldn't be doing. So staying up late, constantly being on your phone, eating bad foods, all of these things that we allow ourselves to do, and we're welcome to do. That's fine. I do them myself. You know, I'm not saying I'm perfect in this regard, but we all take liberties with what we are willing to put up with. And so we need to, at some point, consider, am I sabotaging my own recovery by being a bit too loose with this? You know, am I just not getting better because I'm just not willing to put in the work it takes to really resolve my diet or really resolve the emotional issues? And again, you can go back to my example of, you know, I've found that I've got a certain hip movement that I avoid. It seems to be related to some sort of mental, emotional trauma. And I don't want to confront that. Generally speaking, I'm interested in that kind of stuff, and it is something that I will confront eventually, but there is a form of resistance there. But it's a resistance that I can afford to have, because it doesn't really impair my day-to-day life. I can do the things that I want to do. This is more so because I'm so focused on all of these things and I spend a lot of time thinking about it that I'm aware of it. But that is a form of resistance. And so if this issue came to really disrupt my life, I would have to confront that resistance. I would have to say, okay, look, I gotta face this and face this discomfort and go through the stuff that I don't want to go through. And that you'll get that in a much clearer way with psychological issues or psychological components of pain. But ultimately the rambling point is there needs to be that personal responsibility, that there needs to be that personal understanding. You just need to understand these things well enough, and if you're not willing to, you need to accept that you're only going to ever get partial solutions, and that can be fine. And this relates to a broader issue in the midst of everything that's going on with COVID. But like ultimately, when it comes to health, it's up to you to decide to what extent you want to be healthy. And it goes for treatment. If someone comes in for treatment, if one is an Olympic hopeful and the other is a grandmother who just wants to be able to play with her grandchildren, their goals are very different, and so the standard to which you're going to hold them and the goals that you're going to set for them are going to be quite different, even though the fundamental principles are going to be the same. And you need to understand that for yourself. Like, to what extent do I want to heal or to get better, or to how much better do I want to become? Do I just want to manage this? Is that a simple matter of I go to the chiropractor once a month, I pay €60, and I'm sort of fine, and if I miss a few appointments then things kind of add up? But that's your decision as long as you understand that. But if you truly want to get to the bottom of these things, and that's what I realized, I can't just do one treatment once a month or whatever. I need to start taking actions for myself. But now I'm at a point where most of my habits are good, like most things work in my favor. I don't need to work that hard to maintain my health, because I've changed my habits over time and it's easy for me. But it could be better, and there are certain things that I allow myself to do, and that's because within the realm of what my goals are, what my priorities are, that's fine. That's within the realm of acceptable for me. Now, for someone else, it wouldn't be, and that's for them to determine and for them to understand. And that really helps when you're seeking out treatment, because you can then be very clear about what you're looking for. Because a lot of treatment works somewhat in the narrative. So if you understand that massage, for the most part, is a stress reduction, it's a stress management method. Most massage is just an hour for you to relax and sort of keep your muscles supple, perhaps, arguably. But if you go in and you feel like, well, I need to be fixed and I'm going to this massage and this person is going to realign everything and physically, mechanically fix me, and that's the narrative that you're going in, and you're not being clear about what you want and what you expect, and the therapist doesn't really understand what you want and they're just doing their thing, you're going to have an issue, because you're going to go in, you're going to be expecting things from massage that you should not be expecting, because massage cannot achieve those things. So again, having this understanding of yourself, first of all. What is my story? What is my background? What does it mean? How does it ripple out? What are my tendencies? So one thing, for example, for me is, this is not so much related to my pain, but just related to my life. Like I definitely noticed, like, I really dislike confrontation, and it's something I'm dealing with at the moment, is that, like, I have a lot of strong opinions about things, and I disagree with a lot of people, and I'm not bothered with the whole debate of it all, and I really dislike confrontation, And some things are so, like, for example, what I'm talking about this, like, I'm just rambling and rambling, and I need to cover all of these ideas, and that can be very hard to do in this debate scenario where you're going point, back and forth, and you can't, I always think about these things in this sort of totality of things, in this very broad sense. And so it's causing me a lot of stress to have a lot of opinions about what's going on at the moment. And I have this tendency of avoiding conflict, and I can relate that back to childhood and to certain things, and that's somewhat intertwined with my health issues and the pain I dealt with. And so I understand that about myself, and with that understanding about myself, I can in turn find a way to sort of channel this kind of energy, because what ends up happening is I have all these strong opinions and I just don't want to voice them. I don't want to say what I'm thinking, and that's part of the value of having this podcast, is that I can just explain my ideas, because a lot of the time, a lot of the objections I get to things are I feel like they're all a bit too rudimentary. It's all very basic, and I'm like, I'm not concerned with these simple things. But the point is, because I have this understanding about myself and I understand the effect it's having on me, it's creating a lot of stress and creating a lot of frustration that's just going unchanneled. Because I have that understanding, I can find a way to navigate that, and I can understand where these other symptoms might be coming from. So that's something that was happening actually, particularly this past week, just struggling to sleep, and sleep is usually something that I don't really have issues with, because I understand that I'm dealing with this frustration at the moment, and I understand this tendency that I have and where it's rooted. I can be sort of more proactive, and were I to seek some sort of treatment for it, I would be able to get to the bottom of things much quicker. And that's something that I've noticed is very important when you're treating people who understand themselves, even treating other therapists. It's so much quicker, it's so much easier, because they're either on the same page or close to being on the same page, and you can kind of get through things very quickly. And because so much of this is educational and explaining things and understanding things in the right way, you can save a lot of time. You can get a lot done by simply having that awareness, by simply understanding yourself and understanding your tendencies. So when you explain something, you can pepper in all of these little nuances and little things that kind of give a much broader context. So, I mean, that's sort of essentially it. I hope that makes sense. I hope that clarifies the importance, for one, of personal responsibility. I hope you've gotten some sort of insight into just how important it is, and just how unfeasible it is to actually get better and to truly resolve issues with the way things are, with the way medical treatment is done. And even this somewhat extends to alternative methods of treatment. Like, I spend a lot of time on getting people to understand themselves, but even at that, like, I'm acknowledging that you need to do that, but working with even the best therapists that I could, people I know that are excellent at what they do, unless you know a lot of these things, like, things are going to be missed. And that's just reality. That's the reality we live in, and that's just the way it is. So we can either choose to acknowledge that, or sort of be in denial. So now, in terms of something practical for you to do, because it would be an awful shame if I just tried to uproot your whole view of the world and just left you in a hole of uncertainty. So I'll try not to do that. But the simplest thing you can do, and I talked about this in the newsletter, is to just start paying attention. Set time aside every day to listen internally, to focus on what's going on inside your body, And this isn't about meditation or, clearing your head. It's actually probably best not to clear your head, or to be focused, but to focus on specific things and see what comes up. So if you focus maybe on a specific body part, do certain thoughts come up, do certain emotions come up. So for example, for me, when I move the hip in that certain way, when I create that internal rotation combined with the shift of the pelvis in this specific way, what comes up for me? What does that mean? How does that fit in to the greater context of what I'm dealing with and what I've dealt with in the past, and what can I get from that? And a lot of this is you're just building awareness. You're building a map of your internal state and of your story, and with that you can be more proactive. And a lot of this works in this sort of unconscious way where you're just building a more accurate representation of what's going on and what you've been through, and with that you can take better actions, because most of your actions are unconscious. Most of the time we go on autopilot and we go based off stories and preconceived notions and things that are built on what we've experienced in the past. So a lot of what we're trying to do is to update those filters, to update those stories in the past. And that's a lot of what we do with therapy, like physical therapy or otherwise, is, a body is avoiding a certain movement. It feels like that old movement is unsafe. So we're going to reintroduce it to the movement in a safe way so that the internal story is different. It's saying, actually, it's safe now to do this. It's safe to climb the tree again. I fell off the tree in the past. The overprotective mother that is my brain is telling me, don't climb up that tree. You know what happened last time. But now I've learned from my mistakes. I've healed. I am ready to climb the tree again. It's safe to climb the tree again. And the way you do that is by getting to know yourself, looking inwards, paying attention, just documenting that information. And you can write about it. You can simply just absorb it, let it go in, and let it do its thing. But just broadly speaking, because it's hard to give anything too specific, because this is your process. It's yours to own. It's yours to find what works exactly for you. But don't overthink it. Make an effort to just get to know yourself. Spend some time. Get comfortable with just lying there or sitting there, just observing what's going on. And the analogy I use a lot is that your body is constantly sending you signals. So for example, thirst is a signal, but it's just a signal. You need to act on that signal. So thirst is sort of meaningless without then the action of drinking. But you're constantly getting these very subtle signals to your body, and that's why, like, when you're sitting somewhere, you might shift and change your posture, and it's just to alleviate tension or pressure. And those are signals that you're getting, that you're acting on unconsciously. But there are other signals that you are not acting on because you're not perceiving them. And the reason you're not perceiving them is partially because they're quite subtle, and partially because you're inundated with noise, and not necessarily audible noise, but just constant stimulation. So the world is constantly humming. I'm here in a car park, and hopefully you can't hear them too clearly, but cars are driving by. There's a hum and a buzz of modern life that's constantly there, and you're constantly aware of that on some level, even though you're not focusing on it. And that creates a certain amount of noise, again, not necessarily audible noise, but stimulation to your nervous system that can drown out these more subtle signals that would help you self-regulate. And these signals might be things that tell you, maybe you need to put the phone down. Maybe you need to close your eyes for a bit. Maybe you need to go for a walk. Maybe you need to cry. Maybe you need to, whatever it is. All these little things that in isolation may seem very little, but it all ripples over time, and it all accumulates and all adds up. And over time what you get is this inability to perceive your body's signals. And because you can't even perceive them, you definitely can't act on them because you're not perceiving them. So again, you think of thirst as that signal. It's quite obvious. I'm quite thirsty now. It's meaningless unless I then grab a glass of water. So you need to be able to perceive the signal and then act upon it. And the action that you take then, some of that you're going to have to learn. You're going to have to try different things out and see, well, when I feel this, what is it that I need? Do I need to express myself? Do I need to write it down? Do I need to talk to someone? Do I need to go for a walk? Do I need to move? Do I need to move in this specific way? Do I need to dance? Do I need to just move? And whatever it is, I can't tell you exactly what that's going to be, because again, that's for you to discover. And what you ultimately need to do is to accept that that's the journey that you need to go on, and that's the thing that you need to willingly undertake. So that's it. There you go. That's this week's podcast. I hope that makes sense. Let me know if you have any thoughts, any concerns, anything that's unclear, and I will see you. I think next week I'm going to talk about sort of the context of this lockdown and something I touched on last week, and it's this idea of where do you draw the line? What are your standards? What informs what you find acceptable? And I think that's ultimately what we need to think about when we're looking at all the ways that the world is changing with everything that's going on. Because we need to be certain that things are changing for the right reasons, and that we're accepting change because we actually find it acceptable, rather than because we're just going along with it. So anyway, I won't launch into that now, but that'll be in the newsletter next week and in a podcast as well. So hope you enjoy that. Hope you're looking forward to the next one, and I will see you another time. Have a good day.